Welcome to NASDAQ Trade Talks. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at NASDAQ. Joining me at the market site in Times Square, we have Steve O. He is NASDAQ's head of ETF product and listings. And we're here to help you understand why the new ETF regulation passed by the SEC is important to the ETF industry. Steve, thanks so much for joining us. This has been a big topic of conversation in the FinTwit universe to help people truly understand. So this ETF regulation that was passed by the SEC, can you give us some background and tell us why it's so impactful to the industry?
Sure. It's a big recent development for the ETF industry. The SEC just passed yesterday what's known as the ETF rule, or more formally Rule 6C11. So what the ETF rule does, it simplifies the process for launching ETFs. Currently, ETFs fall under the purview of the Investment Company Act of 1940 that also governs mutual funds and closed-end funds, but because the ETF is a newer structure that provisions of that act. So therefore, what the ETF rule is doing, it's actually creating a new set of rules that strictly governs ETFs, and the idea is that it'll make it easier, more cost effective, and level the playing field for ETF issuers.
What are some of the major highlights?
Yeah, sure. So the first one is around the timing of the implementation. So once the ETF rule becomes effective on the public register, most likely next week or two, there'll be a 60-day period before the rule becomes effective. Now after that, there's going to be about 1 year period where ETFs that are now covered under the ETF rule, those issuers are going to then have to come under compliance. And then within a year after that, those exemptive provisions that were governing before, they're going to go away, and these ETFs will now be covered under the ETF rule. And then going forward, any new ETF listings as well, they're going to also have to they'll go through that called streamlined process within the ETF rule. Other highlights are of the ETF rule around custom baskets. Custom baskets are great because they allow for the market makers to trade a negotiated, let's say, basket of securities in lieu of the ETF that is negotiated with the ETF issuer. So there could be a lot of synergies and benefits as well. And then another major point of the ETF rule is around greater enhanced investor protection as well, with enhanced and standardized items on ETF issuer websites that makes due diligence for ETFs easier to understand. And then one last item as well, which is around the elimination of what's known as the IIV. It's basically an intraday indicative calculator evaluation. The indication is that this valuation is no longer needed, so it won't. So it's no longer be part of the required elements for a listing.
How do you think the ETF community is going to receive this?
So the ETF rule has been generally supported by the industry, by ETF issuers, with some hesitations. When the ETF rule proposal was announced last year, there were certain elements that caused some concern within the industry, and they had expressed their concerns both with meetings with the SEC as well as also within the comment letters, the public comment letters addressing these concerns. Now, with the final concept that was approved by the SEC, a lot of those called concerns were addressed. It looks like the SEC was very thoughtful about consideration, and so a lot of major elements of concern were addressed, and I'm seeing a lot of enthusiasm and excitement right now coming from ETF issuers.
What role will NASDAQ play as an ETF venue for listings in the implementation of the new rule?
Sure. So NASDAQ's always been very supportive of the ETF rule for the benefits to investors and to ETF issuers as well. When the ETF rule proposal came out a year ago, we wrote a comment letter in support of the ETF rule, and now that the new rule is out, we're excited to help support it, to continue the advocacy, and see what role we can play to help the implementation process be more efficient and effective.
All right, to wrap up here, in terms of the entire investing community, how it will be received, will investors like you and I notice the difference?
I think the biggest impact of the ETF rule is really going to be around, with the simplification, which the faster time to market, which leads to lower cost to come to market as well. The ETF rule will definitely lead to more ETF issuance within the industry. So investors will have more choice. I expect a big uptick in the number of ETF issuances coming out in 2020 and 2021. Another element as well is that fixed income ETFs and active ETFs also are going to be the biggest beneficiaries because of the custom basket and the nuances around how these funds are managed and how the underlying assets trade. And so they're going to be huge beneficiaries of that custom basket that was just approved. And then also coupled with the other major regulatory item in the ETF landscape this year, which was the approval of the Presidian active shares. Between all of these, all of these rules, we're definitely going to see a significant interest and a spike in new issuances. And finally, the big hope is that with the ETF rule, with the streamlining of the process, with the SEC now having more time and to not have to deal with a lot of these nuanced exemptive reliefs, hopefully they'll have more time on their hands, and it'll also lead to more efficiency in other regulatory initiatives as well on the part of the SEC.
All right, Steve, thanks so much for the explainer. And thank you for joining us at MarketSite. And thanks for joining me on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Melantrino, Global Markets Reporter at NASDAQ.